Welcome, everybody, and happy Monday. Today we're going to keep it pretty simple, and we're going to read a portion of the chapter on Rainy River together. And then I'm going to have you finish the chapter on your own and finish up chapter notes for the first 4 chapters. Be sure to check back to this document each day for your assignments, because I'm updating it regularly as I try and figure out the best pacing for this new online learning. So don't necessarily look ahead because I might be making adjustments. So I love this chapter so much. It's so beautiful. I think it captures some wonderful nuances of what it's like to be a soldier, and so I want to read some of it together today. So, on Rainy River, this is one story I've never told before, not to anyone, not to my parents, not to my brother or sister, not even to my wife. To go into it, I've always thought, would only cause embarrassment for all of us, a sudden need to be elsewhere, which is the natural response to a confession. Even now, I'll admit, the story makes me squirm. For more than 20 years, I've had to live with it, feeling the shame, trying to push it away, and so by this act of remembrance, by putting the facts down on paper, I'm hoping to relieve at least some of the pressure on my dreams. Still, it's a hard story to tell. So I want to stop for a moment here and discuss how the author is using this speaking kind of in the second person, almost as a confessional to us, the audience, as a way to create that verisimilitude, as a way to blur the lines between this being a fictional book, but this being rooted in truth. Likewise, I think it captures a lot of the ambiguous feelings that many soldiers had about the Vietnam War. And perhaps many soldiers have in regards to war itself. We'll discuss, I'm going to have you respond to a prompt about the archetypes of soldiers tomorrow. But for today, let's think about maybe some of those ways that we think of soldiers and some of the ways that they are more nuanced and more complicated and more human than sometimes that archetype allows. Okay, continuing on. All of us, I suppose, like to believe that in a moral emergency we will behave like the heroes of our youth, bravely and forthrightly, without thought of personal loss or discredit. Certainly, that was my conviction back in the summer of 1968. Tim O'Brien, a secret hero, the Lone Ranger. If the stakes ever became high enough, if the evil were evil enough, if the good were good enough, I would simply tap a secret reservoir of courage that had been accumulating inside me over the years. Courage, I seem to think, comes to us in finite qualities, like an inheritance. And by being frugal and stashing it away and letting it earn interest, we steadily increase our moral capital in preparation for that day when the account must be drawn down. It was a comforting theory. It dispensed with all those bothersome little acts of daily courage. It offered hope and grace to the repetitive coward. It justified the past while amortizing the future. In June of 1968, a month after graduating from McAllister College, I was drafted to fight a war I hated. I was 21 years old. Young, yes, and politically naive. But even so, the American war in Vietnam seemed to me wrong. Certain blood was being shed for uncertain reasons. I saw no unity of purpose, no consensus on matters of philosophy or history or law. The very facts were shrouded in uncertainty. Was it a civil war, a war of national liberation, or simply aggression? Who started it, and when, and why? And what happened to the USS Maddox on the dark night in the Gulf of Tonkin? Was Ho Chi Minh a communist stooge, or a nationalist savior, or both, or neither? What about the Geneva Accords? What about C2 and the Cold War? What about dominoes? America was divided on these and 1,000 other issues, and the debate had spilled out across the floor of the United States Senate and into the streets, and smart men in pinstripes could not agree on even the most fundamental matters of public policy. The only certainty that summer was moral confusion. It was my view then, and still is, that you don't make war without knowing why. Knowledge, of course, is always imperfect, but it seems to me that when a nation goes to war, it must have reasonable confidence in the justice and imperative of its cause. You can't fix your mistakes. Once people are dead, You can't make them undead. So a couple things here. One, he's drafted in 1968, and if we remember from our background building packet and from the documentary, the United States attitude about the war really changes in 1968. The amount of young men being killed in action is mounting. The confusion over purpose is mounting. And so some of the support for the war starts to change, and there is an increasing call to end it and bring the soldiers home. And yet, young men are still being drafted. Likewise, another thing I'd like you to pay attention to in this chapter, but not only this chapter, is this notion of embarrassment. He doesn't want to tell this story because he's embarrassed. And then this notion of courage. He has this idea of what it means to be courageous, and yet he's called on to go be courageous. He thinks it's going to turn on like a light switch. These notions of embarrassment and courage continue throughout this chapter, but also throughout the rest of the book. So kind of keep those things in your mind. What do those big ideas look like for different people? What do they look like for different characters? What is kind of that archetype, that one big picture you think about when you think soldier or courage or things like that? All right, continuing. In any case, those were my convictions, and back in college I had taken a modest stand against the war. Nothing radical, no hothead stuff, just ringing a few doorbells for Gene McCarthy, composing a few tedious, uninspired editorials for the campus newspaper. Oddly, though, it was almost an entirely intellectual activity. I brought some energy to it, of course, but it was the energy that accompanies almost any abstract endeavor. I felt no personal danger. I felt no sense of an impending crisis in my life. Stupidly, with the kind of smug removal that I can't begin to fathom, I assumed that the problems of killing and dying did not fall within my special province. The draft notice arrived on June 17th, 1968. It was a humid afternoon, I remember, cloudy and very quiet, and I'd just come in from a round of golf. My mother and father were having lunch in the kitchen. I remember opening up the letters, scanning the first few lines, feeling the blood go thick behind my eyes. I remember a sound in my head. It wasn't thinking, just a silent howl. A million things all at once. I was too good for this war, too smart, too compassionate, too everything. It couldn't happen. I was above it. I had the world dicked. Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude, and president of the student body, and full ride scholarship to grad studies at Harvard. A mistake, maybe. A foul up in the paperwork. I was no soldier. I hated Boy Scouts. I hated camping out. I hated dirt and tents and mosquitoes. The sight of blood made me queasy, and I couldn't tolerate authority. I didn't know a rifle from a slingshot. I was a liberal, for Christ's sakes. If they needed fresh bodies, why not draft some back to the Stone Age hawk? Or some dumb jingo in his hard hat and bomb Hanoi button? Or one of LBJ's pretty daughters? Or Westmoreland's whole handsome family, nephews and nieces and baby grandson? There should be a law, I thought. If you support a war, if you think it's worth the price, that's fine. But you have to put your own precious fluids on the line. You have to head to the front and hook up with an infantry unit and help spill the blood. And you have to bring along your wife or your kids or your lover. A law, I thought. I remember the rage in my stomach. Later it burned down to a smoldering self-pity, then to numbness. At dinner that night, my father asked what my plans were. Nothing, I said. Wait. I spent the summer of 1968 working in an armor meatpacking plant in my hometown of Worthington, Minnesota. The plant specialized in pork products, and for 8 hours a day I stood on a quarter-mile assembly line, more properly a disassembly line, and removed blood clots from the necks of dead pigs. My job title, I believe, was declotter. After slaughter, the hogs were decapitated, split down the length of the belly, pried open, eviscerated, and strung up by the hind hocks on a high conveyor belt. Then gravity took over. By the time a carcass reached my spot on the line, the fluids had almost drained out. Everything except for thick clots of blood in the neck and upper chest cavity. To remove the stuff, I used a kind of water gun. The machine was heavy, maybe 80 pounds, and was suspended from the ceiling by a heavy rubber cord. There was some bounce to it, an elastic up and down give. The trick was to maneuver the gun with your whole body, not lifting with the arms, just letting the rubber cord do the work for you. At one end was a trigger. At the muzzle end was a small nozzle and a steel roller brush. As a carcass passed by, you leaned forward and swung the gun up against the clots and squeezed the trigger, all in one motion. And the brush would whirl and water would come shooting out, and you'd hear a quick spattering sound as the clots dissolved into a fine red mist. It was not pleasant work. Goggles were a necessity, and a rubber apron, but even so, it was like standing for 8 hours under a lukewarm blood shower. At night, I'd go home smelling of pig. It wouldn't go away. Even after a hot bath, scrubbing hard, the stink was always there, like old bacon or sausage or greasy pig stink that soaked deep into my skin and hair. Among other things, I remembered it was tough getting dates that summer. I felt isolated. I spent a lot of time alone, and there was also that draft notice tucked away in my wallet. In the evenings, I'd sometimes borrow my father's car and drive aimlessly around town, feeling sorry for myself, thinking about the war and the pig factory and how my life seemed to be collapsing towards slaughter. I felt paralyzed. All around me, the options seemed to be narrowing, as if I were hurtling down a huge black funnel and the whole world squeezed in tight. There was no happy way out. The government had ended most graduate school deferments. The waiting list for the National Guard and reserves were impossibly long. My health was solid. I didn't qualify for CO status, conscientious objector. No religious grounds, no history as a pacifist. Moreover, I could not claim to be opposed to the war as a matter of general principle. There were occasions, I believed, when a nation was justified in using military force to achieve its ends, to stop a Hitler or some comparable evil, and I told myself that in such circumstances I would have willingly marched off to battle. The problem, though, was that a draft board did not let you choose your war. Beyond all this, or at the very center, was the raw fact of terror. I did not want to die. Not ever. But certainly not then, not there, not in a war, not in a wrong war. Driving up Main Street past the courthouse and the Ben Franklin store, I sometimes felt the fear spreading inside me like weeds. I imagined myself dead. I imagined myself doing things I could not do, charging an enemy position, taking aim at another human being. At some point in mid-July, I began thinking seriously about Canada. The border lay a few hundred miles north and an 8-hour drive. Both my conscience and my instincts were telling me to make a break for it. Just take off and run like hell and never stop. In the beginning, the idea seemed purely abstract. The word Canada printed itself out in my head. But after a time, I could see particular shapes and images, the story details of my own future, a hotel room in Winnipeg, a battered old suitcase, my father's eyes as I tried to explain myself over the telephone. I could almost hear his voice, and my mother's. Run, I'd think. Then I'd think, impossible. Then a second later, I'd think, run. So I'm going to stop here for a moment. Couple of things I want you paying attention to. This notion of the right war. The generation before, the generation that's raising the Vietnam War generation, fought in World War II, and there was the very clear enemy. We'd been attacked on our soil by the Japanese, and there was a very clear threat of Hitler. And then, of course, the Vietnam War was more abstract. This threat of the abstract communism. So the rest of this chapter deals with some actions that Tim O'Brien takes as he deals with this inner turmoil, this kind of schizophrenia, as he talks about in the next paragraph. So I'd like you to just pay attention to the ways that this challenges that archetype of the soldier, the way that it humanizes it, the way that it gives a deeper, broader sense of what it means to be brave, what it means to have courage. And so finish up this chapter. You can listen to the link I've already posted. And then tomorrow you'll have time to finish up the chapter notes. So chapter notes won't be due first thing tomorrow. You'll have time tomorrow to work on chapter notes. All right, I'm going to post probably about 2 or 3 videos a week. So I'm not going to do these necessarily every single day, but about 2 or 3 times a week. So keep on checking in on that daily agenda every day and email me with questions. Take care, everybody. Bye.